and both of them began to laugh. "Don't sit too close to me," Renato said. "I don't appreciate pukers, but don't go too far either. The old seers are not yet through with their tricks." I moved as close to them as politeness permitted. I was concerned about my state for an instant, and then all my qualms became nonsense, for I noticed that some people were coming toward us. I could not make out their shapes clearly, but I distinguished a mass of human figures moving in the semi-darkness. They did not carry lanterns or flashlights with them, which at that hour they would still have needed. Somehow, that detail worried me. I didn't want to focus on it, and I deliberately began to think rationally. I figured that we must have attracted attention with our loud singing, and they were coming to investigate. Don Juan tapped me on the shoulder. He pointed with a movement of his chin to the men in front of the group of others. "Those 4 are the old seers," he said. "The rest are their allies." Before I could remark that they were just local peasants, I heard a swishing sound right behind me. I quickly turned around in a state of total alarm. My movement was so sudden that Don Juan's warning came too late. "Don't turn around," I heard him yell. His words were only background. They didn't mean anything to me. On turning around, I saw that 3 grotesquely deformed men had climbed up on the rock right behind me. They were crawling toward me, with their mouths open in a nightmarish grimace and their arms outstretched to grab me. I intended to scream at the top of my lungs, but what came out was an agonizing croak, as if something were obstructing my windpipe. I automatically rolled out of their reach and onto the ground. As I stood up, Don Juan jumped to my side at the very same moment that a horde of men, led by those Don Juan had pointed out, descended on me like vultures. They were actually squeaking like bats or rats. I yelled in terror. This time I was able to let out a piercing cry. Don Juan, as nimbly as an athlete in top form, pulled me out of their clutches onto the rock. He told me in a stern voice not to turn around to look, no matter how scared I was. He said that the Allies cannot push at all, but that they certainly could scare me and make me fall to the ground. On the ground, however, the Allies could hold anybody down. If I were to fall on the ground by the place where the seers were buried, I would be at their mercy. They would rip me apart while their allies held me. He added that he had not told me all that before because he had hoped I would be forced to see and understand it by myself. His decision had nearly cost me my life. The sensation that the grotesque men were just behind me was nearly unbearable. Don Juan forcefully ordered me to keep calm and focus my attention on 4 men at the head of a crowd of perhaps 10 or 12. The instant I focused my eyes on them, as if on cue, they all advanced to the edge of the flat rock. They stopped there and began hissing like serpents. They walked back and forth. Their movements seemed to be synchronized. It was so consistent and orderly that it seemed to be mechanical. It was as if they were following a repetitive pattern aimed at mesmerizing me. "Don't gaze at them, dear," Renato said to me, as if he were talking to a child. The laughter that followed was as hysterical as my fear. I laughed so hard that the sound reverberated on the surrounding hills. The men stopped at once and seemed to be perplexed. I could distinguish the shapes of their heads bobbing up and down as if they were talking, deliberating among themselves. Then one of them jumped onto the rock. "Watch out, that one is the seer," Renato exclaimed. "What are we going to do?" I shouted. "We could start singing again," Don Juan replied, matter-of-factly. My fear reached its apex then. I began to jump up and down and to roar like an animal. The man jumped down to the ground. "Don't pay any more attention to those clowns," Don Juan said. "Let's talk as usual." He said that we had gone there for my enlightenment and that I was failing miserably. I had to reorganize myself. The first thing to do was to realize that my assemblage point had moved and was now making obscure emanations glow. To carry the feelings from my usual state of awareness into the world I had assembled was indeed a travesty, for fear is only prevalent among the emanations of daily life. I told him that if my assemblage point had shifted as he was saying it had, I had news for him. My fear was infinitely greater and more devastating than anything I had ever experienced in my daily life. "You're wrong," he said. "Your first attention is confused and doesn't want to give up control. That's all. I have the feeling that you could walk right up to those creatures and face them and they wouldn't do a thing to you." I insisted that I was definitely in no condition to test such a preposterous thing as that. He laughed at me. He said that sooner or later I had to cure myself of my madness, and that to take the initiative and face up to those 4 seers was infinitely less preposterous than the idea that I was seeing them at all. He said that to him, madness was to be confronted by men who had been buried for 2,000 years and were still alive, and not to think that was the epitome of preposterousness. I heard everything he said with clarity, but I was not really paying attention to him. I was terrified of the men around the rock. They seemed to be preparing to jump us, to jump me, really. They were fixed on me. My right arm began to shake as if I were stricken by some muscular disorder. Then I became aware that the light in the sky had changed. I hadn't noticed before that it was already dawn. The strange thing was that an uncontrollable urge made me stand up and run to the group of men. I had, at that moment, 2 completely different feelings about the same event. The minor one was of sheer terror. The other, the major one, was of total indifference. I could not have cared less. When I reached the group, I realized that Don Juan was right. They were not really men. Only 4 of them had any resemblance to men, but they were not men either. They were strange creatures with huge yellow eyes. The others were just shapes that were propelled by the 4 that resembled men. I felt extraordinarily sad for those creatures with yellow eyes. I tried to touch them, but I could not find them. Some sort of wind scooped them away. I looked for Don Juan and Genaro. They were not there. It was pitch black again. I called out their names over and over again. I thrashed around in darkness for a few minutes. Don Juan came to my side and startled me. I did not see Genaro. "Let's go home," he said. "We have a long walk." Don Juan commented on how well I had performed at the sight of the buried seers, especially during the last part of our encounter with them. He said that a shift of the assemblage point is marked by a change in light. In the daytime, light becomes very dark. At night, darkness becomes twilight. He added that I had performed 2 shifts by myself, aided only by animal fright. The only thing he found objectionable was my indulging in fear, especially after I had realized that warriors have nothing to fear. "How did you know I had realized that?" I asked. "Because you were free. When fear disappears, all the ties that bind us dissolve," he said. "An ally was gripping your foot because it was attracted by your animal terror." I told him how sorry I was for not being able to uphold my realizations. "Don't concern yourself with that," he laughed. "You know that such realizations are a dime a dozen. They don't amount to anything in the life of warriors because they are cancelled out as the assemblage point shifts. What Genaro and I wanted to do was to make you shift very deeply. This time, Genaro was there simply to entice the old seers. He did it once already, and you went so far into the left side that it will take quite a while for you to remember it. Your fright tonight was just as intense as it was that first time when the Seers and their allies followed you to this very room. But your sturdy first attention wouldn't let you be aware of them. Explain to me what happened at the sight of the Seers, I asked. The allies came out to see you, he replied. Since they have very low energy, they always need the help of men. The 4 Seers have collected 12 allies. The countryside in Mexico, and also certain cities, are dangerous. What happened to you can happen to any man or woman. If they bump into that tomb, they may even see the Seers and their allies, if they are pliable enough to let their fear make their assemblage points shift. But one thing is for sure, they can die of fright. But do you honestly believe that those Toltec Seers are still alive? I asked. He laughed and shook his head in disbelief. It's time for you to shift that assemblage point of yours just a bit, he said. I can't talk to you when you are in your idiot's stage. He smacked me with the palm of his hand on 3 spots, right on the crest of my right hip bone, on the center of my back below my shoulder blades, and on the upper part of my right pectoral muscle. My ears immediately began to buzz. A trickle of blood ran out of my right nostril and something inside me became unplugged. It was as if some flow of energy had been blocked and suddenly began to move again. What were those Seers and their allies after? I asked. Nothing, he replied. We were the ones who were after them. The Seers, of course, had already noticed your field of energy the first time you saw them. When you came back, they were set to feast on you. You claim that they are alive, Don Juan, I said. You must mean that they are alive as allies are alive. Is that so? That's exactly right, he said. They cannot possibly be alive as you and I are. That would be preposterous. He went on to explain that the ancient Seers' concern with death made them look into the most bizarre possibilities. The ones who opted for the allies pattern had in mind, doubtless, a desire for a haven, and they found it at a fixed position in one of the 7 bands of inorganic awareness. The Seers felt that they were relatively safe there. After all, they were separated from the daily world by a nearly insurmountable barrier, the barrier of perception set by the assemblage point. When the 4 Seers saw that you could shift your assemblage point, they took off like bats out of hell, he said, and laughed. Do you mean that I assembled one of the 7 worlds? I asked. No, you didn't, he replied. But you have done it before, when the Seers and their allies chased you. That day you went all the way to their world. The problem is that you love to act stupid, so you can't remember it at all. I'm sure that it is the Nagual's presence, he continued, that sometimes makes people act dumb. When the Nagual Julian was still around, I was dumber than I am now. I am convinced that when I'm no longer here, you'll be capable of remembering everything. Don Juan explained that since he needed to show me the Death Defiers, he and Genaro had lured them to the outskirts of our world. What I had done at first was a deep lateral shift, which allowed me to see them as people. But at the end, I had correctly made the shift that allowed me to see the Death Defiers and their allies as they are. Very early the next morning, at Silvio Manuel's house, Don Juan called me to the big room to discuss the events of the previous night. I felt exhausted and wanted to rest, to sleep, but Don Juan was pressed for time. He immediately started his explanation. He said that the old Seers had found out a way to utilize the rolling force and be propelled by it. Instead of succumbing to the onslaughts of the tumbler, they rode with it and let it move their assemblage points to the confines of human possibilities. Don Juan expressed unbiased admiration for such an accomplishment. He admitted that nothing else could give the assemblage point the boost that the tumbler gives. I asked him about the difference between the Earth's boost and the tumbler's boost. He explained that the Earth's boost is the force of alignment of only the amber emanations. It's a boost that heightens awareness to unthinkable degrees. To the new seers, it is a blast of unlimited consciousness, which they call total freedom. He said that the tumbler's boost, on the other hand, is the force of death. Under the impact of the tumbler, the assemblage point moves to new, unpredictable positions. Thus, the old seers were always alone in their journeys, although the enterprise they were involved in was always communal. The company of other seers on their journeys was fortuitous and usually meant struggle for supremacy. I confessed to Don Juan that the concerns of the old seers, whatever they may have been, were worse than morbid horror tales to me. He laughed uproariously. He seemed to be enjoying himself. You have to admit, no matter how disgusted you feel, that those devils were very daring, he went on. I never liked them myself, as you know, but I can't help admiring them. Their love for life is truly beyond me. How can that be love for life, Don Juan? It's something nauseating, I said. What else could push a man to those extremes if it is not love for life? He asked. They loved life so intensely that they were not willing to give it up. That's the way I have seen it. My benefactor saw something else. He believed that they were afraid to die, which is not the same as loving life. I say that they were afraid to die because they loved life and because they had seen marvels, and not because they were greedy little monsters. No. They were aberrant because nobody ever challenged them, and they were spoiled like rotten children. But their daring was impeccable, and so was their courage. Would you venture into the unknown out of greed? No way. Greed works only in the world of ordinary affairs. To venture into that terrifying loneliness, one must have something greater than greed. Love. One needs love for life, for intrigue, for mystery. One needs unquenching curiosity and guts galore, so don't give me this nonsense about your being revolted. It's embarrassing. Don Juan's eyes were shining with contained laughter. He was putting me in my place, but he was laughing at it. Don Juan left me alone in the room for perhaps an hour. I wanted to organize my thoughts and feelings. I had no way to do that. I knew without any doubt that my assemblage point was at a position where reasoning does not prevail, yet I was moved by reasonable concerns. Don Juan had said that technically, as soon as the assemblage point shifts, we are asleep. I wondered, for instance, if I was sound asleep from the stand of an onlooker, just as Genaro had been asleep to me. I asked Don Juan about it as soon as he returned. You are absolutely asleep, without having to be stretched out, he replied. If people in a normal state of awareness saw you now, you would appear to them to be a bit dizzy, even drunk. He explained that during normal sleep, the shift of the assemblage point runs along either edge of man's band. Such shifts are always coupled with slumber. Shifts that are induced by practice occur along the midsection of man's band and are not coupled with slumber, yet a dreamer is asleep. Right at this juncture is where the new and the old seers made their separate bids for power, he went on. The old seers wanted a replica of the body, but with more physical strength, so they made their assemblage points slide along the right edge of man's band. The deeper they moved along the right edge, the more bizarre their dreaming body became. You yourself witnessed last night the monstrous result of a deep shift along the right edge. He said that the new seers were completely different. that they maintain their assemblage points along the midsection of man's band. If the shift is a shallow one, like the shift into heightened awareness, the dreamer is almost like anyone else in the street except for a slight vulnerability to emotions, such as fear and doubt. But at a certain degree of depth, the dreamer who is shifting along the midsection becomes a blob of light. A blob of light is the dreaming body of the new seers. He also said that such an impersonal dreaming body is more conducive to understanding and examination, which are the basis of all the new seers do. The intensely humanized dreaming body of the old seers drove them to look for answers that were equally personal, humanized. Don Juan suddenly seemed to be groping for words. "There is another death defy," he said curtly. "So unlike the four you've seen that he's indistinguishable from the average man in the street. He's accomplished this unique feat by being able to open and close his gap whenever he wants." He played with his fingers, almost nervously. "The ancient seer that the Nagual Sebastian found in 1723 is that death defier," he went on. "We count that day as the beginning of our line, the second beginning. That death defier, who's been on the earth for hundreds of years, has changed the lives of every Nagual he met, some more profoundly than others, and he has met every single Nagual of our line since that day in 1723. Don Juan looked fixedly at me. I got strangely embarrassed. I thought my embarrassment was the result of a dilemma. I had very serious doubts about the content of the story, and at the same time, I had the most disconcerting trust that everything he had said was true. I expressed my quandary to him. "The problem of rational disbelief is not yours alone," Don Juan said. "My benefactor was at first plagued by the same question. Of course, later on he remembered everything, but it took him a long time to do so. When I met him, he had already recollected everything, so I never witnessed his doubts. I only heard about them. The weird part is that people who have never set eyes on the man have less difficulty accepting that he's one of the original seers. My benefactor said that his quandaries stemmed from the fact that the shock of meeting such a creature had lumped together a number of emanations. It takes time for those emanations to separate themselves." Don Juan went on to explain that as my assemblage point kept on shifting, a moment would come when it would hit the proper combination of emanations. At that moment, the proof of the existence of that man would become overwhelmingly evident to me. I felt compelled to talk again about my ambivalence. "We're deviating from our subject," he said. "It may seem that I'm trying to convince you of the existence of that man, and what I meant to talk about is the fact that the old seer knows how to handle the rolling fours. Whether or not you believe that he exists is not important. Someday, you'll know for a fact that he certainly succeeded in closing his gap. The energy that he borrows from the Nagual every generation he uses exclusively to close his gap." "How did he succeed in closing it?" I asked. "There is no way of knowing that," he replied. "I've talked to two other Naguals who saw that man face to face, the Nagual Julian and the Nagual Elias. Neither of them knew how. The man never revealed how he closes that opening, which, I suppose, begins to expand after a time. The Nagual Sebastian said that when he first saw the old seer, the man was very weak, actually dying, but my benefactor found him prancing vigorously, like a young man." Don Juan said that the Nagual Sebastian nicknamed that nameless man the Tenant, for they struck an arrangement by which the man was given energy, lodging, so to speak, and he paid rent in the form of favors and knowledge. "Did anybody ever get hurt in the exchange?" I asked. "None of the Naguals who exchanged energy with him was injured," he replied. The man's commitment was that he'd only take a bit of superfluous energy from the Nagual in exchange for gifts, for extraordinary abilities. For instance, the Nagual Julian got the Gate of Power. With it, he could activate or make dormant the emanations inside his cocoon in order to look young or old at will. Don Juan explained that the Death Defiers in general went as far as rendering dormant all the emanations inside their cocoons except those that matched the emanations of the Allies. In this fashion, they were able to imitate the Allies in some form. Each of the Death Defiers we had encountered at the rock, Don Juan said, had been able to move his assemblage point to a precise spot on his cocoon in order to emphasize the emanations shared with the Allies and to interact with them. But they were all unable to move it back to its usual position and interact with people. The Tenant, on the other hand, is capable of shifting his assemblage point to assemble the everyday world as if nothing had ever happened. Don Juan also said that his benefactor was convinced, and he fully agreed with him, that what takes place during the borrowing of energy is that the old sorcerer moves the Nagual's assemblage point to emphasize the Allies' emanations inside the Nagual's cocoon. He then uses the great jolt of energy produced by those emanations that suddenly become aligned after being so deeply dormant. He said that the energy locked within us in the dormant emanations has a tremendous force and an incalculable scope. We can only vaguely assess the scope of that tremendous force if we consider that the energy involved in perceiving and acting in the world of everyday life is a product of the alignment of hardly 1/10 of the emanations encased in man's cocoon. What happens at the moment of death is that all that energy is released at once, he continued. Living beings at that moment become flooded by the most inconceivable force. It is not the rolling force that has cracked their gaps, because that force never enters inside the cocoon. It only makes it collapse. What floods them is the force of all the emanations that are suddenly aligned after being dormant for a lifetime. There is no outlet for such a giant force except to escape through the gap. He added that the old sorcerer has found a way to tap that energy. By aligning a limited and very specific spectrum of the dormant emanations inside the Nagual's cocoon, the old seer taps a limited but gigantic jolt. How do you think he takes that energy into his own body? I asked. By cracking the Nagual's gap, he replied. He moves the Nagual's assemblage point until the gap opens a little. When the energy of newly aligned emanations is released through that opening, he takes it into his own gap. Why is that old seer doing what he's doing? I asked. My opinion is that he's caught in a circle he can't break, he replied. We got into an agreement with him. He's doing his best to keep it. So are we. We can't judge him, yet we have to know that his path doesn't lead to freedom. He knows that, and he also knows he can't change it. He's trapped in a situation of his own making. The only thing he can do is to prolong his ally-like existence as long as he possibly can. Chapter 16. The Mold of Man. Right after lunch, Don Juan and I sat down to talk. He started without any preamble. He announced that we had come to the end of his explanation. He said that he had discussed with me in painstaking detail all the truths about awareness that the old seers had discovered. He stressed that I now knew the order in which the new seers had arranged them. In the last sessions of his explanation, he said he had given me a detailed account of the two forces that aid our assemblage points to move, the Earth's boost and the rolling force. He had also explained the three techniques worked out by the new seers, stalking, intent, and dreaming, and their effects on the movement of the assemblage point. Now, The only thing left for you to do before the explanation of the mastery of awareness is complete, he went on, is to break the barrier of perception by yourself. You must move your assemblage point unaided by anyone and align another great band of emanations. Not to do this will turn everything you've learned and done with me into merely talk, just words. Words are fairly cheap. He explained that when the assemblage point is moving away from its customary position and reaches a certain depth, it breaks a barrier that momentarily disrupts its capacity to align emanations. We experience it as a moment of perceptual blankness. The old seers called that moment the wall of fog, because a bank of fog appears whenever the alignment of emanations falters. He said that there were 3 ways of dealing with it. It could be taken abstractly, as a barrier of perception. It could be felt as the act of piercing a tight paper screen with the entire body. Or it could be seen as a wall of fog. In the course of my apprenticeship with Don Juan, he had guided me countless times to see the barrier of perception. At first, I had liked the idea of a wall of fog. Don Juan had warned me that the old seers had also preferred to see it that way. He had said that there is great comfort and ease in seeing it as a wall of fog, but that there is also the grave danger of turning something incomprehensible into something somber and foreboding. Hence, his recommendation was to keep incomprehensible things incomprehensible, rather than making them part of the inventory of the first attention. After a short-lived feeling of comfort in seeing the wall of fog, I had to agree with Don Juan that it was better to keep the transition period as an incomprehensible abstraction. But by then, it was impossible for me to break the fixation of my awareness. Every time I was placed in a position to break the barrier of perception, I saw the wall of fog. On one occasion in the past, I had complained to Don Juan and Genaro that although I wanted to see it as something else, I couldn't change it. Don Juan had commented that that was understandable because I was morbid and somber, that he and I were very different in this respect. He was light-hearted and practical, and he didn't worship the human inventory. I, on the other hand, was unwilling to throw my inventory out the window, and consequently I was heavy, sinister, and impractical. I had been shocked and saddened by his harsh criticism and became very gloomy. Don Juan and Genaro had laughed until tears rolled down their cheeks. Genaro had added that on top of all that, I was vindictive and had a tendency to get fat. They had laughed so hard, I finally felt obliged to join them. Don Juan had told me then that exercises of assembling other worlds allowed the assemblage point to gain experience in shifting. I had always wondered, however, how to get the initial boost to dislodge my assemblage point from its usual position. When I'd questioned him about it in the past, he pointed out that since alignment is the force that is involved in everything, intent is what makes the assemblage point move. I asked him again about it. "You're in a position now to answer that question yourself," he replied. "The mastery of awareness is what gives the assemblage point its boost. After all, there is really very little to us human beings. We are, in essence, an assemblage point fixed at a certain position. Our enemy, and at the same time our friend, is our internal dialogue, our inventory. Be a warrior. Shut off your internal dialogue. Make your inventory and then throw it away. The new seers make accurate inventories and then laugh at them. Without the inventory, the assemblage point becomes free." Don Juan reminded me that he had talked a great deal about one of the most sturdy aspects of our inventory, our idea of God. That aspect, he said, was like a powerful glue that bound the assemblage point to its original position. If I were going to assemble another true world with another great band of emanations, I had to take an obligatory step in order to release all ties from my assemblage point. That step is to see The mold of man, he said. You must do that today, unaided. What's the mold of man? I asked. I've helped you see it many times, he replied. You know what I'm talking about. I refrained from saying that I did not know what he was talking about. If he had said that I had seen the mold of man, I must have done that, although I didn't have the foggiest idea what it was like. He knew what was going through my mind. He gave me a knowing smile and slowly shook his head from side to side. The mold of man is a huge cluster of emanations in the great band of organic life, he said. It is called the mold of man because the cluster appears only inside the cocoon of man. The mold of man is the portion of the eagle's emanations that seers can see directly without any danger to themselves. There was a long pause before he spoke again. To break the barrier of perception is the last task of the mastery of awareness, he said. In order to move your assemblage point to that position, you must gather enough energy. Make a journey of recovery. Remember what you've done. I tried, unsuccessfully, to recall what was the mold of man. I felt an excruciating frustration that soon turned into real anger. I was furious with myself, with Don Juan, with everybody. Don Juan was untouched by my fury. He said matter-of-factly that anger was a natural reaction to the hesitation of the assemblage point to move on command. It will be a long time before you can apply the principle that your command is the eagle's command, he said. That's the essence of the mastery of intent. In the meantime, make a command now, not to fret, not even at the worst moments of doubt. It will be a slow process until that command is heard and obeyed as if it were the eagle's command. He also said that there was an unmeasurable area of awareness in between the customary position of the assemblage point and the position where there are no more doubts, which is almost the place where the barrier of perception makes its appearance. In that unmeasurable area, warriors fall prey to every conceivable misdeed. He warned me to be on the lookout and not lose confidence, for I would unavoidably be struck at one time or another by gripping feelings of defeat. The new seers recommend a very simple act when impatience or despair or anger or sadness comes their way, he continued. They recommend that warriors roll their eyes. Any direction will do. I prefer to roll mine clockwise. The movement of the eyes makes the assemblage point shift momentarily. In that movement, you will find relief. This is in lieu of true mastery of intent. I complained that there was not enough time for him to tell me more about intent. It will all come back to you someday, he assured me. One thing will trigger another. One key word and all of it will tumble out of you as if the door of an overstuffed closet had given way. He went back then to discussing the mold of man. He said that to see it on my own, unaided by anyone, was an important step because all of us have certain ideas that must be broken before we are free. The seer who travels into the unknown to see the unknowable must be in an impeccable state of being. He winked at me and said that to be in an impeccable state of being is to be free of rational assumptions and rational fears. He added that both my rational assumptions and my rational fears were preventing me, at that moment, from realigning the emanations that would make me remember seeing the mold of man. He urged me to relax and move my eyes in order to make my assemblage point shift. He repeated over and over that it was really important to remember having seen the mold before I see it again, and since he was pressed for time, there was no room for my usual slowness. I moved my eyes as he suggested. Almost immediately, I forgot my discomfort, and then a sudden flash of memory came to me, and I remembered that I had seen the mold of man. It had happened years earlier, on an occasion that had been quite memorable to me because, from the point of view of my Catholic upbringing, Don Juan had made the most sacrilegious statements I had ever heard. It had all started as a casual conversation while we hiked in the foothills of the Sonoran Desert. He was explaining to me the implications of what he was doing to me with his teachings. We had stopped to rest and had sat down on some large boulders. He had continued explaining his teaching procedure, and this had encouraged me to try for the 100th time to give him an account of how I felt about it. It was evident that he didn't want to hear about it anymore. He made me change levels of awareness and told me that if I would see the mold of man, I might understand everything he was doing and thus save us both years of toil. He gave me a detailed explanation of what the mold of man was. He didn't talk about it in terms of the eagle's emanations, but in terms of a pattern of energy that serves to stamp the qualities of humanness on an amorphous blob of biological matter. At least, I understood it that way, especially after he further described the mold of man using a mechanical analogy. He said that it was like a gigantic die that stamps out human beings endlessly, as if they were coming to it on a mass-production conveyor belt. He vividly mimed the process by bringing the palms of his hands together with great force, as if the die molded a human being each time its two halves were clapped. He also said that every species has a mold of its own, and every individual of every species molded by the process shows characteristics particular to its own kind. He began then an extremely disturbing elucidation about the mold of man. He said that the old seers, as well as the mystics of our world, have one thing in common. They have been able to see the mold of man, but not understand what it is. Mystics, throughout the centuries, have given us moving accounts of their experiences. But these accounts, however beautiful, are flawed by the gross and despairing mistake of believing the mold of man to be an omnipotent, omniscient creator. And so is the interpretation of the old seers, who called the mold of man a friendly spirit, a protector of man. He said that the new seers are the only ones who have the sobriety to see the mold of man and understand what it is. What they have come to realize is that the mold of man is not a creator, but the pattern of every human attribute we can think of, and some we cannot even conceive. The mold is our God because we are what it stamps us with, and not because it has created us from nothing and made us in its image and likeness. Don Juan said that in his opinion, to fall on our knees in the presence of the mold of man reeks of arrogance and human self-centeredness. As I heard Don Juan's explanation, I got terribly worried. Even though I had never considered myself to be a practicing Catholic, I was shocked by his blasphemous implications. I had been politely listening to him, yet I had been yearning for a pause in his barrage of sacrilegious judgments in order to change the subject, but he went on drumming his point in a merciless way. I finally interrupted him and told him that I believed that God exists. He retorted that my belief was based on faith and, as such, was a second-hand conviction that did not amount to anything. My belief in the existence of God was, like everyone else's, based on hearsay and not on the act of seeing, he said. He assured me that even if I was able to see, I was bound to make the same misjudgment that mystics have made. Anyone who sees the mold of man automatically assumes that it is God. He called the mystical experience a chance seeing, a one-shot affair that has no significance whatsoever because it is the result of a random movement of the assemblage point. He asserted that the new seers are indeed the only ones who can pass a fair judgment on this matter because they have ruled out chance seeings and are capable of seeing the mold of man as often as they please. They have seen, therefore, that what we call God is a static prototype of humanness without any power. For the mold of man cannot, under any circumstances, help us by intervening in our behalf, or punish our wrongdoings, or reward us in any way. We are simply the product of its stamp. We are its impression. The mold of man is exactly what its name tells us it is: a pattern, a form, a cast that groups together a particular bunch of fiber-like elements, which we call man. What he had said put me in a state of great distress, but he seemed unconcerned with my genuine turmoil. He kept on needling me with what he called the unforgivable crime of the chance seers, which makes us focus our irreplaceable energy on something that has no power whatsoever to do anything. The more he talked, the greater my annoyance. When I became so annoyed that I was about to shout at him, he had me change into yet a deeper state of heightened awareness. He hit me on my right side between my hip bone and my rib cage. That blow sent me soaring into a radiant light, into a diaphanous source of the most peaceful and exquisite beatitude. That light was a haven, an oasis in the blackness around me. From my subjective point of view, I saw that light for an immeasurable length of time. The splendor of the sight was beyond anything I can say, and yet I couldn't figure out what it was that made it so beautiful. Then the idea came to me that its beauty grew out of a sense of harmony, a sense of peace and rest, of having arrived, of being safe at long last. I felt myself inhaling and exhaling in quietude and relief. What a gorgeous sense of plenitude. I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that I had come face to face with God, the source of everything, and I knew that God loved me. God was love and forgiveness. The light bathed me, and I felt clean, delivered. I wept uncontrollably, mainly for myself. The sight of that resplendent light made me feel unworthy, villainous. Suddenly, I heard Don Juan's voice in my ear. He said that I had to go beyond the mold, that the mold was merely a stage, a stopover that brought temporary peace and serenity to those who journey into the unknown, but that it was sterile, static. It was, at the same time, a flat, reflected image in a mirror and the mirror itself. And the image was man's image. I passionately resented what Don Juan was saying. I rebelled against his blasphemous, sacrilegious words. I wanted to tell him off, but I couldn't break the binding power of my seeing. I was caught in it. Don Juan seemed to know exactly how I felt and what I wanted to tell him. "You can't tell the Nagual off," he said in my ear. "It is the Nagual who's enabling you to see. It is the Nagual's technique, the Nagual's power. The Nagual is the guide." It was at that point that I realized something about the voice in my ear. It was not Don Juan's, although it sounded very much like his voice. Also, the voice was right. The instigator of that seeing was the Nagual Juan Matus. It was his technique and his power that was making me see God. He said it was not God, but the mold of man. I knew that he was right, yet I could not admit that. Not out of annoyance or stubbornness, but simply out of a sense of ultimate loyalty to and love for the divinity that was in front of me. As I gazed into the light with all the passion I was capable of, the light seemed to condense, and I saw a man. A shiny man that exuded charisma, love, understanding, sincerity, truth. A man that was the sum total of all that is good. The fervor I felt on seeing that man was well beyond anything I had ever felt in my life. I did fall on my knees. I wanted to worship God personified, but Don Juan intervened and whacked me on my left upper chest, close to my clavicle, and I lost sight of God. I was left with a tantalizing feeling, a mixture of remorse, elation, certainties, and doubts. Don Juan made fun of me. He called me pious and careless and said I would make a great priest. Now I could even pass for a spiritual leader who had had a chance seeing of God. He urged me in a jocular way to start preaching and describe what I had seen to everyone. In a very casual but seemingly interested manner, he made a statement that was part question, part assertion. "And the man," he asked. "You can't forget that God is a male." The immensity of something indefinable began to dawn on me as I entered into a state of great clarity. "Very cozy, eh?" Don Juan added, smiling. "God is a male. What a relief!" After recounting to Don Juan what I had remembered, I asked him about something that had just struck me as being terribly odd. To see the mold of man, I had obviously gone through a shift of my assemblage point. The recollection of the feelings and realizations I had had then was so vivid that it gave me a sense of utter futility. Everything I had done and felt at that time, I was feeling now. I asked him how it was possible that, having had such a clear comprehension, I would have forgotten it so completely. It was as if nothing of what had happened to me had mattered, for I always had to start from point one, regardless of how much I might have advanced in the past. "That's only an emotional impression," he said. "A total misapprehension. Whatever you did years ago is solidly enclosed in some unused emanations. That day when I made you see the mold of man, for instance, I had a true misapprehension myself. I thought that if you saw it, you would be able to understand it. It was a true misunderstanding on my part." Don Juan explained that he had always regarded himself as being very slow to understand. He had never had any chance of testing his belief because he did not have a point of reference. When I came along and he became a teacher, which was something totally new to him, he realized that there is no way to speed up understanding and that to dislodge the assemblage point is not enough. He had thought that it would be sufficient. Soon he became aware that since the assemblage point normally shifts during dreams, sometimes to extraordinarily distant positions, whenever we undergo an induced shift, we are all experts at immediately compensating for it. We rebalance ourselves constantly, and activity goes on as if nothing has happened to us. He remarked that the value of the new seer's conclusions does not become evident until one tries to move someone else's assemblage point. The new seers said that what counts in this respect is the effort to reinforce the stability of the assemblage point in its new position. They considered this to be the only teaching procedure worth discussing, and they knew that it is a long process that has to be carried out little by little at a snail's pace. Don Juan said then that he had used power plants at the beginning of my apprenticeship in accordance with a recommendation of the new seers. They knew, by experience and by seeing, that power plants shake the assemblage point way out of its normal setting. The effect of power plants on the assemblage point is in principle very much like that of dreams. Dreams make it move, but power plants manage the shift on a greater and more engulfing scale. A teacher then uses the disorienting effects of such a shift to reinforce the notion that the perception of the world is never final. I remembered then that I had seen the mold of man 5 more times over the years. With each new time, I had become less passionate about it. I could never get over the fact, however, that I always saw God as a male. At the end, it stopped being God for me and became the mold of man, not because of what Don Juan had said, but because the position of a male God became untenable. I could then understand Don Juan's statements about it. They had not been blasphemous or sacrilegious in the least. He had not made them from within the context of the daily world. He was right in saying that the new seers have an edge in being capable of seeing the mold of man as often as they want, but what was more important to me was that they had sobriety in order to examine what they saw. I asked him why it was that I always saw the mold of man as a male. He said that it was because my assemblage point did not have the stability then to remain completely glued to its new position and shifted laterally in man's band. It was the same case as seeing the barrier of perception as a wall of fog. What made the assemblage point move laterally was a nearly unavoidable desire or necessity to render the incomprehensible in terms of what is most familiar to us. A barrier is a wall, and the mold of man cannot be anything else but a man. He thought that if I were a woman, I would see the mold as a woman. Don Juan stood up then and said that it was time for us to take a stroll in town, that I should see the mold of man among people. We walked in silence to the square, but before we got there, I had an uncontainable surge of energy and ran down the street to the outskirts of town. I came to a bridge, and right there, as if it had been waiting for me, I saw the mold of man as a resplendent, warm, amber light. I fell on my knees, not so much out of piety, but as a physical reaction to awe. The sight of the mold of man was more astonishing than ever. I felt, without any arrogance, that I had gone through an enormous change since the first time I had seen it. However, all the things I had seen and learned had only given me a greater, more profound appreciation for the miracle that I had in front of my eyes. The mold of man was superimposed on the bridge at first. Then I refocused my eyes and saw that the mold of man extended up and down into infinity. The bridge was but a meager shell, a tiny sketch superimposed on the eternal. And so were the minute figures of people who moved around me, looking at me with unabashed curiosity. But I was beyond their touch, although at that moment I was as vulnerable as I could be. The mold of man had no power to protect me or spare me, yet I loved it with a passion that knew no limits. I thought that I understood then something that Don Juan had told me repeatedly, that real affection cannot be an investment. I would have gladly remained the servant of the mold of man, not for what it could give me, for it has nothing to give, but for the sheer affection I felt for it. I had the sensation of something pulling me away, and before I disappeared from its presence, I shouted a promise to the mold of man. But a great force whisked me away before I could finish stating what I meant. I was suddenly kneeling at the bridge, while a group of peasants looked at me and laughed. Don Juan got to my side and helped me up and walked me back to the house. There are two ways of seeing the mold of man, Don Juan began as soon as we sat down. You can see it as a man, or you can see it as a light. That depends on the shift of the assemblage point. If the shift is lateral, the mold is a human being. If the shift is in the midsection of man's band, the mold is a light. The only value of what you've done today is that your assemblage point shifted in the midsection. He said that the position where one sees the mold of man is very close to that where the dreaming body and the barrier of perception appear. That was the reason the new seers recommend that the mold of man be seen and understood. Are you sure you understand what the mold of man really is? He asked with a smile. I assure you, Don Juan, that I'm perfectly aware of what the mold of man is, I said. I heard you shouting inanities to the mold of man when I got to the bridge, he said with a most malicious smile. I told him that I had felt like a worthless servant worshipping a worthless master, and yet I was moved out of sheer affection to promise undying love. He found it all hilarious and laughed until he was choking. The promise of a worthless servant to a worthless master is worthless, he said, and choked again with laughter. I didn't feel like defending my position. My affection for the mold of man was offered freely, without thought of recompense. It didn't matter to me that my promise was worthless. Chapter 17. The Journey of the Dreaming Body. Don Juan told me that the two of us were going to drive to the city of Oaxaca for the last time. He made it very clear that we would never be there together again. Perhaps his feeling might return to the place, he said, but never again the totality of himself. In Oaxaca, Don Juan spent hours looking at mundane, trivial things, the faded color of walls, the shape of distant mountains, the pattern on cracked cement, the faces of people. Then we went to the square and sat on his favorite bench, which was unoccupied, as it always was when he wanted it. During our long walk in the city, I had tried my best to work myself into a mood of sadness and moroseness, but I just couldn't do it. There was something festive about his departure. He explained it as the unrestrainable vigor of total freedom. Freedom is like a contagious disease, he said. It is transmitted. Its carrier is an impeccable nagual. People might not appreciate that, and that's because they don't want to be free. Freedom is frightening, remember that. But not for us. I've groomed myself nearly all my life for this moment, and so will you. He repeated over and over that at the stage where I was, no rational assumptions should interfere with my actions. He said that the dreaming body and the barrier of perception are positions of the assemblage point, and that knowledge is as vital to seers as knowing how to read and write is to modern man. Both are accomplishments attained after years of practice. It is very important that you remember right now the time when your assemblage point reached that position and it created your dreaming body, he said with tremendous urgency. Then he smiled and remarked that time was extremely short. He said that the recollection of the main journey of my dreaming body would put my assemblage point in a position to break the barrier of perception in order to assemble another world. The dreaming body is known by different names, he said after a long pause. The name I like the best is the other. That term belongs to the old seers together with the mood. I don't particularly care for their mood, but I have to admit that I like their term. The other. It's mysterious and forbidden. Just like the old seers, it gives me the feeling of darkness, of shadows. The old seers said that the other always comes, shrouded in wind. Over the years, Don Juan and other members of his party had tried to make me aware that we can be in two places at once, that we can experience a sort of perceptual dualism. As Don Juan spoke, I began to remember something so deeply forgotten that at first it was as if I had only heard about it. Then, step by step, I realized that I had lived that experience myself. I had been in two places at once. It happened one night in the mountains of northern Mexico. I had been collecting plants with Don Juan all day. We had stopped for the night, and I had nearly fallen asleep from fatigue when suddenly there was a gust of wind and Don Genaro sprang up from the darkness right in front of me and nearly scared me to death. My first thought was one of suspicion. I believed that Don Genaro had been hiding in the bushes all day, waiting for darkness to set in before making his terrifying appearance. As I looked at him prancing around, I noticed that there was something truly odd about him that night. Something palpable, real, and yet something I couldn't pinpoint. He joked with me and horsed around, performing acts that defied my reason. Don Juan laughed like an idiot at my dismay. When he judged that the time was right, he made me shift into heightened awareness, and for a moment I was able to see Don Juan and Don Genaro as two blobs of light. Genaro was not the flesh and blood Don Genaro that I knew in my state of normal awareness, but his dreaming body. I could tell because I saw him as a ball of fire that was above the ground. He was not rooted as Don Juan was. It was as if Genaro, the blob of light, were on the verge of taking off, already up in the air, a couple of feet off the ground, ready to zoom away. Another thing I had done that night, which suddenly became clear to me as I recollected the event, was that I knew automatically that I had to move my eyes in order to make my assemblage point shift. I could, with my